So today's lesson is going to be on what we call the market revolution. This is the change of industry and transportation, an enormous impact on early American both economic development, but also geographic expansion. And there are going to be several themes that we want to explore. This is what we would call a thematic topic. And this is coming from period 4, concept 4.2. It says here, innovations, developments in tech, agriculture, and commerce sped up our economy. Precipitate means to lead to, leading to changes in U.S. society and to our identities, both as a nation and regions. We'll be looking at transportation, innovations in technology, particularly in the area of manufacturing, as well as agriculture. And you may recall some names that we've already covered from that. And this is going to lead to what something's called a market revolution. I'll explain that further. Types of innovations, including textiles, the steam engine, interchangeable parts, the telegraph, and agricultural. So for those of you who are reviewing, you may recall that this is an area that we covered pretty much in depth earlier. And then, of course, infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads by the Civil War. This expanded our ability to trade with each other, thus interdependence, regional interdependence, and infrastructure linkages in transportation. The major point will be to understand what the market revolution did, its effects on society, as well as the changes it created for workers, particularly from going from sort of yeoman, semi-subsistence farmers, almost like the traditional cottage system, until now they were consuming goods that were often created in distant markets, much like we today. Class differences, changes in class, standards of living, the emergence of a middle class really for the first time in large numbers, the elite in the business sector, and also increase in the working poor. And then finally, we'll close with gender roles, particularly the cult of domesticity and the increasing division of society into separate spheres divided by gender. We'll be looking at big themes. We're not going to cover the South too much today. The South will be another topic in terms of slavery, cotton manufacturing and development. But we will discuss how the cotton cotton agricultural production of the South will lead to the industrial transformations in the North, particularly. So let's get into it. I sometimes joke that this is sort of the shun themes, the IONs. You have expansion, immigration, urbanization, mechanization, and transportation. So if you're writing a LEQ or DBQ about the antebellum period, these themes are going to go on throughout the entire era. So when you consider the War of 1812, this will delay some of that, but immediately after the War of 1812, it will accelerate. Then you get into the Mexican-American War and how it played a role into this as well, with the other key developments during this period. So we want to look at first where people were located. At the end of the War of 1812, most of the American population was rural, where they were concentrated heavily were on the coast, though in some fairly small cities. If you look here, there's only, in 1820, one city that's population is above 100,000. It's New York. Then you see you have a couple in both Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston. So with that, very few large cities in the United States, even as late as 1820. But very quickly, in the span of 40 years, a dramatic increase in urbanization. So you can see here the major changes in a very short amount of time, considerably on the coast, but also on the Ohio River Valley, along the Mississippi, around the Great Lakes, and even in California, in San Francisco. So major change from that to that. And these are today really where most of the population concentration in the North still remain. Obviously, things like transportation and access to water make a huge difference. I've shown you guys this graphic once before. This is a useful graphic because it shows where the population center of the United States is, meaning where half the country lived east of this in 1790. So if you think about where Delaware is located or where Washington, D.C. and Baltimore are located, half the U.S. was east of it, half west at the end of the Revolutionary period. Very quickly, by the end of the War of 1812, most of America was concentrated. Well, actually, America was divided east of this and west of this. So as you can see today, more or less the geographic center of the United States is around St. Louis. That means east half the population, west half the population. That's pretty fascinating graphic. I always like that one. And hopefully you could analyze it and explain why the shift has occurred here. So what was life like on the frontier? Hard to say specifically individually, but there are definitely some consensus points of view that are shared. And I think a lot about during the pandemic, how people feel isolated and feel cut off. And that's what people in the West frequently felt. Life was very difficult, conflict with Native Americans, easy exposure to diseases. And the folks that lived there tended to be your most individualistic, often superstitious, with very little information or schooling. But the impact that it had on the environment was dramatic. Farmers moving westward would frequently not consider the impact that they were having. Your textbook describes this as ecological imperialism. Here you see the destruction of the beaver population, the bison population, the otter population, both for furs and for also food, and just really a lack of effort at conserving our lands, our animals and land. So America was a young population. Half the country was under the age of 30 around the time of the Civil War. Very mobile, as you saw earlier from the graphic. Very difficult lifestyle, and rarely ever came together. Exceptions might be some heavy construction project, some development of infrastructure privately. By and large, though, the American people did not seek out groups because of distance. It was just very difficult. And you can see here that there are two major factors that are going to influence the size of the United States. Fairly slow in the early period. You can consider life at Jamestown, the Pilgrims. But during the 1830s through the 1860s, dramatic increase in the population. Two reasons. One is natural reproduction, the larger reason. Americans were living longer and having children. And then the other, of course, is immigration. And this is another map that kind of shows how America's population density changes. Not only are they located further west now, but they're beginning to develop cities in the western part of the United States. Here you can see around the area of Louisville, a little bit in the central parts of the southern states. Dramatically changed, particularly in New England. If you look at the New England and New York, you'll see a huge change in population density. And as the your notes say here, birth rate accounted for most of it. Every 25 years, the nation's population doubled. But during the 40s, the 1840s, we saw a huge increase in immigration, particularly for two reasons, which we'll look at here in a moment: the Irish and the Germans. And it's during that period that the population really starts to explode as well. And this is another graphic that you can see the dramatic increase of immigrants to the United States during the 1840s. Overwhelmingly, the two nations that deposited the largest number of people were the Irish, and then the Germans were not a singular country. This would be the Germanic states, but they produced the two largest groups of immigrants. You can see that Brits are still migrating here to a degree, and then far smaller numbers remaining. So let's look at Ireland. Why now? So most Americans are familiar with what's called the Irish potato famine, the blight that destroyed the potato crop in Ireland, which was the staple of the Irish diet. This is how the Irish people basically survived. Particularly, they were tenant farmers working lands owned by wealthy absentee landlords. They were not fed. The Irish poor laws were very, you might consider, harsh. They were designed to both embarrass and not really provide you with much food. So millions of Irish left the country. And you can see here that where they landed typically were port cities. We've looked at some movies that dealt with that. They were too poor to leave the city once they got here. They would not frequently become farmers. Instead, they would remain urban factory workers. And initially, they were not very well welcomed at all. They were perceived as, as the dregs of society. The Irish were impoverished. Frequently, they were very, very poor and undereducated. And they had another characteristic, which today we Americans don't necessarily recognize as problematic, but for the quote, I am emphasizing quote, Native Americans, meaning the sort of first generation of immigrants, they perceive the Catholics as disloyal and as potential risks and dangers, as well as a threat to their jobs. So you had a sort of popular slogan emerge in some of these cities: "No Irish need apply," or simply the acronym NINA. Now, the Irish, when they came here, sought to transport benevolent societies, societies designed to help each other, both from, quote, ancient Hibernia, which was the old name for Ireland, but also here in the United States. And so they would help people sort of as settlements. And this predates the settlement movement of the late 19th century, but this was sort of an ethnic settlement group that would help you find work. They often had their own political bosses. They also created the first sort of noteworthy labor union in the United States. The Irish had to frequently pick the most dangerous jobs. So you think of the coal miners, and they would form a society which would become a union known as the Molly Maguires. A secret society unions were illegal at the time. Over time, because so many Irish settled in these cities and were able to vote, they largely voted Democratic. If you ever have a question about who were sort of consistent Democrats, the urban Irish overwhelmingly would be a group that represented that. And you'll see a political machine emerge in New York City. If you forgot what a machine is, this is a elected group of people who give kickbacks and give patronage to folks that will work for the government as either contractors or direct employees in the case of Ball's Tweed. And then they'll use that employment and the opportunity for money to get kickbacks and bribes for themselves. And they'll kind of grease the wheel with this money. And so you have the most infamous of all of the political machines, which was Irish and Democratic, and emerged in Manhattan. It's called Tammany Hall. So don't forget, this is a development in the 1840s, Ball's Tweed. And so here you have a Shamrock Society. And I've actually, I think, talked with some of you about this quote earlier. And that is that, the only encouragements we hold out to strangers are a good climate, fertile soil, wholesome air and water, plenty of food, good pay, kind neighbors, good laws, free government, and a hearty welcome. And then the rest depends on you. So this is high praise. This is quite a compliment from this individual, Clement Burley, of this Irish organization called the Shamrock Society. You may remember, again, immigrants with an E means to leave. These are people coming to America from somewhere else. Now, the other group that migrated in fairly large numbers, comparable numbers, were folks from the German Confederation. These were not today's Germans. These were from a variety of states, Hesse and Prussia and Bohemia. But they migrated primarily for two reasons. One, of course, before the Irish came, the opportunity for land would not have sort of encouraged the Irish, because the Irish were poor. But for the Germans, who actually had money, they would come over entire families, and they would settle in the Louisiana Purchase territory, or the old Northwest of the Northwest Ordinance, particularly the regions around Wisconsin. You can think of cities like Milwaukee with its large beer production as being Germanic. And again, they would come because of a crop failure, economic. But then you also had something called the failed revolutions of 1848. Those of you who had European history may recall that there was a nationalist movement in Europe, particularly in the Germanies and in Italy, and it had not succeeded, but it had shown the people of those countries an opportunity that self-government could exist, however, not in 1848. And so they fled because they were seen as enemies of the monarchies, of the autocrats. And in America, they would have more opportunity. So they become known as the 48ers. Now, the Germans brought with them a host of developments that they'd had in Europe: the rifle, Christmas tree, kindergarten, and they were typically liberal in the sense that they believed in genuine freedom. These were liberal revolutions, after all. And many of the Germans would become abolitionists and an integral part of the Republican Party in the 1860s, most notably a fellow named Carl Schurz. I don't think you have to know Carl Schurz by name, but he's certainly a useful outside info if you were to write about the role of the Germans politically, as an example. Now, the Germans, like the Irish, were seen with a great deal of hostility. Not all Germans were Catholic. Some Germans were Lutheran, particularly from northern Germany. But nonetheless, they were distinctive in a sense that they had their own language, their own culture. It would not have been inconceivable to hear Beethoven or Bach or Mozart being performed in some Minnesota or Wisconsin frontier village. They lived in isolated communities. Frequently, entire families came intact, and something that was still unpopular in the United States, but certainly helped them be more healthy, was that they drank beer. Now, today, we don't see beer drinking as a healthy thing, but because beer has had the bacteria and the water has been, in essence, purified by the manufacturing of beer, this makes it more healthy in a sense that it didn't cause you things like cholera, typhus. So another sort of reinforcement of these two ethnic groups, again, the largest group during the early 40s, late 30s, would be the Irish. The Germans would begin to come at the end of the 40s, the 48ers. You can see here the Irish predominantly in areas that are green. You can see the Germans in areas that are purple. So Boston, New York, lesser degree Philadelphia, Wisconsin for the Germans, Minnesota. Now, this is one of the first times you see this notion. Now, it certainly had existed before. I've already mentioned that men like Andrew Jackson rose from really impoverished conditions to quite successful. And this becomes known in America as the American dream. And we still use this term. It appears in writing and journalism and things like that. And it's the idea that you can, in the United States, advance materially due to your own endeavors, because the country holds out the promise of free opportunity. Free in a sense that you're not going to be restricted by the government to pursue your own advance, your own wealth. This, of course, is a hotly debated subject among some historians, among some writers. Is the American dream genuine? But the idea is that this was an allure to people, and then they would write about that there was the opportunity to progress. You can think about the fact that Americans were frequently moving westward, frequently innovating new ideas. If there was a problem, they would try to solve it. They wouldn't wait for someone else to do it. They would come up with it themselves. There was no class system defined in the United States, no nobility, no hereditary monarchy. And so America truly was a land of opportunity. Even as early as the 1840s, this was highly noted by immigrants. Push-pull is a factor you need to consider. Push means, why do you leave a place? Pull, why do you come into a place? America, for its entire history, has been a pull country, a country that pulled others in, a land of opportunity. And so they were fleeing famine, and they were fleeing war, and America offered them a chance for a restart. And now you're going to have a backlash to that. Nativism is present here in the United States today. Today it's more directed towards Latinos and folks of Middle Eastern descent. But in the beginning, nativism was an idea that second-generation Americans held, typically third or fourth generations in some cases, that these immigrants were invading our country, and they were transforming our country in ways that these nativists felt to be a danger. Or you mentioned the Catholic immigrants, particularly the Irish, and the rise of Catholicism really frightened these nativists. And I'll show you a cartoon in a minute. This led to the founding of an organization, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, that would ultimately evolve from an anti-immigrant organization into an anti-immigrant platform party. So the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner becomes the very famous Know Nothing Party, ultimately. And what their objective was to restrict immigration, was to ban immigration, to cut back immigration. And there's two reasons for this, primarily. One, of course, was the fear and dislike of the other, the folks who were different from themselves. Another reason, though, was clearly economic competition. Individuals did not want to compete with immigrants who typically worked lower income jobs, lower jobs pay-wise, and that served to depress wages in areas where immigrants were most frequently found. And you can see violence targeted towards them. You see a convent was burned here in Boston. At times, the Irish fought back. You had sort of domestic civil infighting between immigrants and the nativists. And here's I think a terrific insight that you can really see, kind of interesting cartoons of the period, and that is this is a bishop or even a pope, a papist figure, a pope. You can see what we call the mitre has been turned into a crocodile's mouth. And so this is cartoon criticizing this sort of crocodile nature, predatory nature of the Catholic Church. There was, nativists were highly suspicious of Catholics because they were concerned that they would owe their allegiance to a foreign prelate, a foreign religious leader, and not to the American people. And the background here is very fascinating. You see sort of traditional native defending the children from the dangerous crocodiles of the Ganges, which of course is hyperbole, but nonetheless, this idea that the church would prey upon the American body politic, as well as the infestation, if you will, of these terrible Irish people. So, as mentioned before, you see a transformation from the Order of the Star Spangled Banner into the Know Nothing Party, the American Party. And you should know it as the Know Nothing Party. I think that's the best way to write. And it's something most of you probably remember pretty easily. So here is a congressman who is a Know Nothing. He's defending his point of view. You can see here the gentleman, he's referencing another speaker, has been anxious to proclaim the death of Americanism. Sir, it is a principle that can never die. Native Americanism seeks to defend every institution under our Constitution. We've been told that we belong to a party of an idea. Our great object is to attain unity of national character. We go for everything American in contradistinction to everything foreign. So the idea of this unified definition of what an American is, no alien has a right to naturalization. That's interesting. You may recall the Federalists had already passed something called the Alien Act, which was repealed under Jefferson. The Republican Party would see the Know-Nothings sort of merge with the Whigs and the Free Soilers. But the Know-Nothings had a serious setback when Abraham Lincoln strongly rejected nativism from his own government. So in the 1860s, nativism sort of sees a decline in the heart of the Civil War. It will resurge strongly in the post-Civil War period with nativism towards new immigrants, and they call it the Italians and Eastern Europeans. Now, the Industrial Revolution occurs first in England. England had the resources and the ability to do this first, to start in around the 1750s. You saw individuals in England developing factories, developing key textile inventions. So when you think about this market revolution, this commercial revolution, this industrial revolution, the first element of it is a textile factory system, the end of the cottage system in England, the rise of industry. The technological developments that created this shift from sort of subsistence farming, the idea of the domestic system creating piecemeal small amounts of material would be transformed dramatically through the factory system, through the manufacturing of industrial factories. America was initially resistant to this, not overtly at times, although individuals like Jefferson and Madison really were critical of the factory system, but the absence of many workers early on in American history. So when Hamilton creates the economic system for the United States, he hopes to see this improve. Jefferson, though, is not a supporter of it. So you see very little capital. For example, the Bank of the United States is not going to be a source of easy capital to finance the rise of factories. The immigrants have not started coming in large numbers, so we don't really have the labor supply the British did. The British had something called the enclosure movement, which had created sort of a large amount of homelessness and sort of unemployed masses roaming the streets of England. And the British had a head start. They were already about 50 years ahead of the United States, so they were good at it by the time America began to become functioning. To give a sense, and I use this statistic, it's unfortunate today that I've seen 30 million plus Americans are currently unemployed during the pandemic. So this statistic here at the bottom is not currently accurate. What it does show you, though, is that currently, or as of pre-January 2020, millions of Americans were still involved in manufacturing. It's 13 million. But we're post-industrial in some respect, or sometimes it's called the fourth industrial revolution. This is the first. This is when Americans begin to shift from agriculture and domestic system to the factory system. Today, very few comparable Americans do that type of work. So we're really back to the kind of numbers we see in America today percentage-wise before the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. So who are the first to do factories? And they were British immigrants. So they typically were folks who knew how to develop machinery and have blueprints for factories, and they snuck them out of Britain into the United States. So we kind of do this first in New England, Rhode Island with its swift rivers. This is the power source. Keep this in mind. This is pre-mass production of the steam engine. So the running water, if you had a swift waterfall, this can serve as a power source, you know, a water supply. It would turn wheels. And as I said, he came from Britain. He came over here to kind of seize the opportunity to produce post-American Revolution great success. And so he did. He created the first cotton mill, the Samuel Slater. It's called the Slatersville Mill. At the time, cotton was still fairly not available, so he did both wool and cotton. Wool was the initial textile for England. Of course, the enormous demand for fabric to continue to make clothing and to make things like bed sheets led to a demand for ready-made, cheap fabric, and that cotton would certainly serve that purpose once we Americans kind of figured that out. So America, again, was known as a nation of innovators. Quickly, Yankee ingenuity allowed for America to take a look at what was going on abroad, and we'd say, oh, wow, that's pretty cool, and then we'd do it, and then we'd improve on it. And a lot of these inventors were really guys who saw someone that were inspired by someone else. And in the case of Eli Whitney, it's particularly fascinating because Eli Whitney was a New England Yankee himself, but when he took a tour of the South, the belief is that he discovered that this was actually something that was being manufactured, not manufactured, but being operated on a southern farm, small scale. He said this is a brilliant idea. It's 50 times more likely to be productive in terms of generating from the cotton lint to the actual fabric. So you definitely want to recall Eli Whitney as a specific outside info. His cotton gin, which you see here, short for engine, his principle of interchangeable parts is really going to lay the foundation for the manufacturing system of the whole Industrial Revolution. The idea of if you take a gun apart and take another gun apart and shuffle the pieces together and then reassemble them, it will still work. Rather than having one individual piece handcrafted by some skilled mechanic, now you could have mass production of machinery. So Whitney really is a twofer for us. We know that he manufactured firearms, like Colt, but he also was the inventor, so to speak, the patent holder of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin transformed America probably more than any single machine to the train. It overwhelmingly led to a demand for more labor. Ordinary Europeans did not want to pick cotton, very difficult and really brutal agricultural job. And you're going to see an enormous explosion in demand for slavery. South's economy will be dramatically changed in terms of increase in demand for land for cotton. The other two inventors of the period, Howe and Singer. Singer is the name that's probably most familiar to Americans. That's the name you should most remember. The Singer sewing machine will become ubiquitous. You'll see it in almost every home. Northern factories will have hundreds of them. And this would be used to manufacture clothing. It led to a dramatic decrease in the price of ready-made clothes. Led many new employees in factories, mostly women. So it's become clearly women's work. And the guide for the AP, the College Board, gives a point that the Supreme Court, I think John Marshall as Chief Justice and other justices, overwhelmingly supported property rights. Even as late as Roger Taney, you see the defense of property and contracts over the government's ability to limit that and restrict that. And you may recall some of the cases from John Marshall, Fletcher v. Peck, that involved contract disputes. In New York, you see the first general incorporation law. So the idea of a corporation is born in, interestingly enough, 1848, another year of historic events, the end of the Mexican War, the Seneca Falls Convention, the failed revolutions. And you do not need a charter. The initial businesses in the United States, joint stock companies and subsequent companies, had to have the lawmaking body of the state pass a charter just to create a business. This is a serious delay in the process of creating a business. And so general incorporation allows businesses to be formed. And then another key development is the idea of limited liability. Limited liability basically says that you cannot risk more money than you invest into a company. So if you're a stockholder in, let's say, United Airlines, or today there's concern about protecting companies who may expose their customers to the virus. You see around America today, meat packing companies want assurances from Congress. Other companies want assurances from Congress. If we keep working and our workers get sick or the public gets sick as a result of this, we don't want to have to be liable for that. The idea is a limited liability is that the owner can't risk more money than he puts into the company, the owner being the stockholder. Really benefited investment. And of course, the government did very little to involve itself in business, but you could argue that it wasn't truly laissez-faire because the government did take a pro-business attitude. And this is really where capitalism starts to just take off in the United States. Capitalism becomes, initially Americans were not in any way convicted on large scale on the being identified as capitalists. You may recall Adam Smith's book isn't even printed until 1776. And really the Wealth of Nations was a condemnation of mercantilism. It wasn't a endorsement of industrial capitalism. So this is a transformation both in Europe, particularly in places like Britain, but also in the United States, where Americans and Brits become part of a larger economic system that they really can't imagine having control over. So laissez-faire capitalism is going to take off in the post-war of 1812 period. Now, another major change in both culture and society was the development of the telegraph, and with it the subsequent Morse code. Samuel Morse was allowed to conquer great distances to communicate instantaneously. Now, today we would look at this sort of primitive machine and say, what's the goodness of this? Or what's the benefit of this? But here you see the telegraph as patented by Morse with his code, Morse code. You had professionals who would learn how to transcribe this into whatever the person had sent. Very, very popular during the Civil War. And you see for the first time in American history, the development of what looks like phone lines, and these are telegraph lines. So later on, when Bell develops a telephone, it's not hard to just run the lines on the existing telegraph cable lines. And if you've driven down the road in the United States in any location, you've probably seen these type of poles. Now, this line from the book of Numbers in the Bible is what was suggested to Samuel Morse to be the first thing he typed. And it comes from the quote, "Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time, it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought?" Statement, not question. He doesn't put a question mark at the end of it or an exclamation point, so it's sort of ambivalent. But it's a sort of, what has God done? It's the greatness of God. Like the idea of creating a powerful, instantaneous communication is almost like magic. And then developing from the telegraph is the first major telegraph cable layer. And it's hard to imagine that this is as lucrative as it turns out to be, but he will try to lay a cable across the Atlantic Ocean to Ireland. It fails initially, but ultimately we do succeed in running a cable, and now we can communicate instantaneously with Europe. And so thousands and thousands of miles are crossed in a second. And that makes the world seem a lot smaller. And Field will ultimately become a titan of industry, a very successful businessman here. So you have the first time, I think, in modern history, the debate about the role of the worker. For most of history of humanity post, from the Dark Ages to present, had been the idea of there were people who owned goods and land, particularly land, and then everybody else worked for them. But in America, individuals worked for themselves. The yeoman farmer lived almost as a subsistence lifestyle. You didn't work for anyone, and you didn't sell much to anyone. It was a very, very small, almost crude economic system. But at the same time, it was very individualistic and very independent. With the factory system, that changes dramatically. You no longer have this sort of historic role of master, sort of an expert mechanic who is training an apprentice. Now you have thousands of people potentially working under management, very impersonal, and they're working for wages that put them basically on the same standard of living as they were prior as yeoman farmers. It's almost hard to imagine giving that lifestyle up to become a factory worker, but this was the only way to really guarantee yourself income, as minimal as it was. And working in factories was terrible. There's no other way around it. It was an absolute nightmare. You work 12, 15-hour days. You would 12 to 15 hours. You were very low pay, frequently the waste, garbage, the heat or cold, stifling conditions, and you couldn't organize to try to improve your conditions. And perhaps most, I think, significantly, is half of all factory workers were kids the age of my youngest son, 9 years old. And that just is a horrifying statistic. Consider it today, we could not imagine today a 9-year-old working in a highly unhealthy, unsanitary, dangerous factory where their life was at risk. But this was actually quite normal. And this is some pictures. These are actual photographs from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And they're kids about my kids' age. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking to see them working in these exposed machines that endanger their safety. And the amount of money, they would be paid 1/4 of an adult male. There were dunking rooms where children's heads would be held under cold water. They would be, with reforms, guaranteed 2 hours of education a day, excuse me. So not very good time to be a worker. However, as things began to gradually change, and if you're attentive here, you'll see that this is right in the middle of Jacksonian democracy. So you definitely want that context. Jacksonian democracy was expanded for workers, particularly who wanted a say in their own government. And they would frequently demand better conditions, better pay. They weren't allowed to unionize, but as voters, the Democratic Party became much more sympathetic to their plight, particularly since the other party typically was backed by the more wealthy industrialists. So, this old political adage about knowing which side your bread is buttered on. These are your voters. You got to take care of your base. So things would slowly change. And of course, the other key issue is the legalization, ultimately, of labor unions. However, unions would suffer serious setbacks, as they frequently did, during the economic downturn. So the Panic of 1837, it ties you in again. Unions had slowly been starting in the 1830s and 40s, but they were really unsuccessful. And so, there's discussion of companies like Amazon and the other companies, Walmart, having their employees going on strike for these terrible events that are occurring in our country today. And I certainly hope that doesn't happen. But, when workers are in high demand and their pay and conditions are very low or miserable, then they're going to agitate typically for better conditions. But when times are rough and they're not considered essential, particularly textile workers or something like that, then they don't have strong participation because the company owners can pay them less and they'll be willing to work that less. So early unions started in New York. Started in New York. Robert Owen, you may recall him, a sort of utopian socialist. And he created a party, so to speak, called the Working Man's Party. Now, this is well before Marx, so the allegation of unions being Marxist may be true later, but not 1929. And they were usually more of a social group, as you can see here, rather than the sort of famous unions that will emerge, like the Knights of Labor or the American Federation of Labor, which haven't happened yet. Massachusetts will be the first state, keep in mind this is Massachusetts, not the U.S. Supreme Court, to authorize the legality of labor unions. But by and large, these were not very effective. So pre-Civil War, because keep in mind, the Irish are coming over by the millions, the Germans not as much, but still coming in a lot. And so labor was plentiful pre-Civil War, during the Civil War, particularly low-skilled labor. And of course, the other reason that there's plentiful labor is that women and children make up the bulk of the workforce. So here is a statement from a union in 1828. Mechanic is the antebellum word for skilled craftsman. If you were a mechanic, you were a person who worked a machine, not the folks that fix your car today, but a machine operator or a workman. The journeyman mechanics, that means, the people who move around, want to form an association to fix the evils of poverty and nonstop toil. If the masses were enabled by their labor to get for themselves and their families an abundant supply of comfort and convenience, they would consume more. They would amount to at least twice. So this is a traditional argument made by workers for the next 2 centuries now, that if you pay workers more, they're going to consume. They're not going to save money. They're going to spend money. And by spending money, you will increase the amount of stuff that you're producing, thus more money for you. The real object of association is to stop, if possible, the evil which arises from the reduction of the value of labor. So this is an interesting argument that if you reduce the value of labor, it's going to reduce their productivity. And that argument certainly is going to be made by other economists later on. Now, the first big factor, and we mentioned Slater, and you definitely don't want to forget Slatersville, but one of the most successful of all American mills and textile mills was the Lowell mills, or were the Lowell mills. The Brits, again, were starting to have more competition. So if you really wanted to be a successful mechanic and a successful entrepreneur, America was a place to do it. And so you see this individual, Francis Lowell. He escapes, so to speak, with secret blueprints to the United States. He gets assistance from this individual, Paul Moody, who helps secure some Quaker backing for his factory. And they built, and their goal, their objective was to build a better textile mill, a better mill to thus create better product, but also more successful, less opposition from workers. And so this becomes known as the Lowell Mill, and the Lowell system. And so the Lowell system was really designed to create a sort of, I don't use the word benevolent, but a streamlined operating economic city around a central industry. Here's the Merrimack River in Lowell. You may recall the Monitor versus the Merrimack. This is that location of that river. And so here along the river, you see company housing. These are not barracks, these are like dormitories and things like that. And the large-scale factory on the river and on the canals. So the water being the major source of power during this period. And the overwhelming people who made up the mill were young women from New England. The mill workers were frequently teenage girls or ladies in their young 20s, and they would come to work, and they would be supervised, usually by a matron and by a business sort of supervisor, shift supervisor. They worked 6 13-hour days, so if you can do the math there, it's 78 hours a week. They worked almost 80 hours. And on Sunday, they were often escorted to the town church. The town mill church, and so you can see several of them dotting around the community here. And eventually, the women would be, these young single women from the countryside would be hosted to something like a dance or a gathering, and their life was in many ways like a college dorm. Now, I don't think working in a factory 13 hours a day sounds like fun, but here they would meet the young men. And then you were expected to get married, and then you didn't do this anymore. If you continue doing this beyond your early 20s and you weren't marriageable, you would be called a spinster. Terrible name to be called, a spinster. A single woman in middle age working in a factory or working in textiles. Their lives are highly regimented. You can see bell schedules out, morning, dinner, evening bells. And they had shifts that varied depending on the time of the season. So here's from March to September, kind of the spring and summer months, and here are the winter months. And you can see they would sort of have their own daylight savings time, if you will, kind of a traditional transformation of the clock. And one of the things I've read over the years and pointed out is that prior to this period in history, the ordinary worker, as a yeoman farmer or subsistence farmer, lived based on the weather and the season. Now you could work and would work all day, every day. Factories never really shut down, and you did this year round. So your life was really much more regimented by the schedule than by the season. So that was a major transformation that you might recall. This is a song from the period, The Factory Girl. You can tell that her environment is not something she's particularly pleased with. She has fear, poison air, no windows, 13-hour workday, low pay. So this is just not a very pleasant experience, but this was normal. And we're really interesting as humans. We adapt to what circumstances we live in, and thus this was normal for them, and really not thought to be much they could do about it. They wished it was better, but it's kind of how it was until the end of this, with the Irish workers taking over. And here you see the Irish are beginning to come in. The Irish ultimately would displace the children as child labor laws would be passed. But women would continue to make up a key part of the workforce well into the present. So what were women doing? Well, only about 10% of women actually worked in factories, white women. Obviously, Southern black women ultimately were, the vast majority were enslaved. But you have this opportunity to get out of your house, so to speak, and find a mate. And I know today that the idea of being single is in no way something that's negative. It's just completely up to you, your choice, young women or older women. But at the time, it really, you didn't imagine life as a single woman in large part. And so once you found that romantic interest, or somebody made for a good match, you got married, and then you transformed into this. And this was really what you were supposed to be as a woman. You were supposed to be a homemaker, a mother, a domestic queen, so to speak, the sort of matron of the household. And for women, this was an important role. It was a source of status. So, they would look down on these women who were working, and sort of the spinster women, and these women would be sort of strong, independent women, so to speak, within their own homes. Now, this cult of domesticity is sometimes called the cult of true womanhood, the cult of true womanhood. So I got this from a book, a book that women read. These are the kind of books that you would read here, Cody's Ladies Book. And of course, there's an element of religious nature to this as well. So what was a woman to do as a married mother and wife? She was to be religious. She was to be, pious. Not supposed to pursue this, intellectual pursuits. Women weren't expected in the antebellum period to get an education. That was not their duty in terms of like a higher education, in terms of high schools or colleges. If you did this, you would lose your proper sphere, so to speak, which was in the home. Obviously, this is sexist, but if the vast majority of women are doing it, it was kind of normal. Purity, you were not expected to be engaged in extramarital relationships or premarital relationships. This kind of connected with that. Women were expected to be submissive, and this is really, if you come to the New Testament of the Bible, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife. Subject yourself to your husband. So this was standard. This was normal. This was what you were supposed to do. Men were regarded as the superior, particularly in areas like finance and income, land. Women were supposed to take care of children and make sure that things like cooking and clothing repairs and beds and flowers and things like that. So if you're going to read, you were allowed to read the Bible, and maybe a biography of somebody like William Bradford. Clearly a sexually discriminating sexist period in history in context of today. But keep in mind, this was seen as a powerful role within the home. Men really, in almost all things, deferred to their wives in the household. So raising the children, making sure that the meals were prepared. This was a woman's role. And we still see strong influences of this in a great number of the American people today. Again, you can see for a long time in our public schools, we had the future homemakers of America. That title has been changed, I understand. But, the role of women was to engage in a domestic economy, not in the public world. And you can see here, interesting enough, this is Catherine Beecher, the great advocate for public education, for education and for teaching, was using this to explain to young ladies what they were supposed to do at home. Okay. Again, the father serving just kind of as the head of the family, and the mother as the sort of heart of the family. So, we talked about where factories emerged. Keep in mind that overwhelmingly it was on the coast of New England. I mean, obviously, if you're transporting goods and materials, either manufactured goods or importing raw materials, you want to do it at a port. Boston being the most important port at that time. And around towns like Walden and Lowell is where you have the largest amount of these really huge factory systems. The South's cotton would come up on paddle boats, would go into the factories, and out would come scores and scores of clothing, which made the price much more affordable. It's hard to imagine life without multiple outfits or articles of clothing, but pre-industrial revolution, most people owned very, very few pieces of clothing. You can see here again that you had some, and I do mean little, but some textile manufacturing. This is pre-Danville Mill. You can see that the Danville Mill is not there. The Dan River Mills is not in operation yet. But in and around Atlanta and a few other southern places, not much though, under 5,000. And that's total spindles, which are these little white things in the background picture here. It's a total spindle, not a whole lot. Meanwhile, massive numbers in New England and along here. It's very heavy. Now, one of the other points that was made on the guide for this unit is the development of technology to increase agriculture. And so most of us are familiar with the name John Deere, but we think of it with tractors. This John Deere development initially was not tractors, but rather the plow that broke the plains. And this is a well-designed plow that created deep furrows and hard topsoil. Wonderful for producing large amounts of corn and wheat. Plows were a key development. You know, Jefferson spent a time trying to invent a good plow. So people talked about plows, you know, compared plows. And when John Deere did this and it could break through the hard topsoil, really transformed the nation's breadbasket. Couple that with the mechanical reaper. You can see it here. It was pulled initially by horses, Cyrus McCormick. So between the plow and the reaper, they're going to transform the interior of the United States, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, into the breadbasket of our country. And so here you see the sort of elevating of the role of farmer, the husbandman. The author writes, the cultivators of the soil create the great industrial class, for they produce the great staples which everyone else depends on. And this will be the language that you'll see later argued in the populist movement. You'll see farmers in the Depression, you know, arguing that, hey, without us, you don't eat. Today, farmers during the pandemic are really struggling. This COVID-19 situation has created a situation where we're seeing farmers having to destroy their products, their produce, their animals, their livestock. And this is really unfortunate because this was an industry today that only about 2% of Americans are engaged in, and it was already very fragile. But at this point in history, the farmers really were the bulk of America. Over half the country were farmers, far more than half. And so here you see a collection of the great inventors of the period. You should certainly be familiar with several, and we'll talk more about Edison post-Civil War.